Okay. Box? It's fine. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay.
Waiting for someone else. I don't know. It's okay. Okay, no problem. See.
We're just going to wait other 2 minutes before starting, okay? Hi, Dima. Thank you for being here on Skype.
Sorry, I... Try again.
Okay, should we start? We are waiting for Mr. Del Alba, but he is coming. Look, so that, good evening. My name is Mark Tarabella. I'm a Belgian MEP in the Socialist Democrat group in this parliament. It's my 4th term in this parliament. I'm newly member of the European Parliament delegation for relations with the country of the Arabic Peninsula. As one of the diplomatic arms of the European Parliament, the delegation for relations with the Arab Peninsula contributes to representing the European Union in the Gulf region and promoting the value of which the European Union is founded, namely the principle of liberty, democracy, respect of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. So, also considering the mission of this delegation, when a couple of months ago, Mr. Luca Dilda, on the European Center for Democracy and Human Rights, asked me to join the organization of this meeting, I decided immediately to get it, basically for 3 kinds of reasons. First of all, because I'm particularly involved in that, as I have the honor to be vice chair of the DARB delegation, delegate in particular at human rights topics. Welcome, Mr. Del Alba. The second reason is the fact that several of young university students from the KUL Leuven and ULB in Brussels are involved. In my opinion, it is particularly important that young people are interested in those issues that are only apparently far from our borders, but in reality they are all draw us together. And last but not least, this evening we will hear from the direct voice of some activists and from the voice of Gianfranco Dell'Alba, chair of the board of Non c'è pace senza giustizia, there is no peace without justice, or the situation on human rights in Bahrain is unfortunately getting worse month by month. Anyway, the focus on Bahrain in the EP is not something new indeed. only considering from 2011, we have had 8 resolutions, the last one in 2018, expressing deep concern over the detention of several activists, including Nabil Rajab, another one in 2016 against death penalty, executions, torture, and ill treatment. One report, a lot of statements, debates, and letters on this situation. In any case, despite our efforts, Bahrain human rights record worsened in 2019, as the government carried out executions, convicted critics for peaceful expression, and threatened social media activists. It's not by me to remember the numbers of this tragedy, but in the 62-page World Report 2020 on Human Rights Watch, anyone could find several serious violations of human rights, from death execution, process violations, and allegations of torture. Bahraini authorities have silenced, exiled, or imprisoned anyone who criticized the government. In 2019, Bahrain witnessed its suppression of online and social media activists. On May 30th, the Interior Ministry declared that it will prosecute people who follow inciting accounts or share such posts on Twitter. No independent media have operated in Bahrain since the Information Affairs Ministry suspended Al-Wazat, the country's only independent newspaper. In 2017, foreign journalists who have written critically about Bahrain, as well as Human Rights Watch and other rights groups, are routinely denied access to the country. We could also speak a lot about freedom of expression, associations, and peaceful assembly violation, arbitrary citizenship revocation, security forces impunities, death penalty, human rights defender sentences, women's rights, gender identity, and sexual orientation. But frankly speaking, better than me, our guest can describe it and tell you about that. From my side, I can promise that until I'm a European Parliament member, I will continue this battle and my efforts to save lives, and to try to save lives, and to improve the situation of human rights defenders in Bahrain and all over the world. Now I would like to give the floor to Luca Dilda for the European Centre of Democracy and Human Rights.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to see how many people are interested in this initiative. My name is Luca Dilda. I'm working for the European Center for Democracy and Human Rights. However, tonight I will only be the moderator of this event, and I will introduce you the subject and the speakers present on this panel. So let me begin with the title of this event. It's Culture of Impunity in Bahrain. What is the role of the EU can play? Since the crackdown on mass pro-democracy protests in Bahrain in February 2011, the country has experienced systematic human rights violations and political turmoil. The government has taken many steps to suppress fundamental rights, including the right to free and peaceful assembly, association, and free expression. Human rights defenders and activists endure multiple and distinct human rights violations, such as arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and torture. So tonight, I would like to ask this panel to discuss the culture of impunity that systematically undermines Bahrain rule of law. The lack of impartiality on the institutional bodies prevent Bahraini citizens not protect all its citizens from human rights abuses. Therefore, it is essential to restart the national dialogue with the leaders of the opposition to reinstate accountability of the authorities. The speakers will also delineate how the EU can play a positive role in Bahrain obligations regarding human rights respect, protection, and fulfillment. Now, let me briefly introduce you to the speakers on this panel. First of all, I want to thank Mark Tarabella, as he said, member of the European Parliament and member of the S&D Group. He made this event possible by hosting here all of us here tonight. As he mentioned earlier, he's the vice chair of the DARP delegation, but he is more than that. He has been involved in many human rights initiatives related to the region, and the fact that you are all sitting here tonight, it's a clear evidence of his interest, engagement, and commitment in defending human rights and promoting European values. So thank you again for hosting us tonight. Then let me introduce to my colleague, Juliet Akewa. She is a member of ACDHR. She will explain better what our NGO does and what is our engagement on these issues. And she will also give you an overview on the general situations of human rights violation in Bahrain. Special thanks goes to Yusuf Al-Hori, who could be here tonight to bring his testimony. He is one of the leading Bahraini activists living in Berlin, and he has taken part in many international conferences, especially at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Also, we have the pleasure to have Gianfranco Dell'Alba, a former member of this parliament who held office for 10 years, and he's the current chair of the board of No Peace Without Justice, an NGO that works on the protection and promotion of human rights, democracy, rule of law, and international justice. Thank you also to Professor Christian Olsen. He is a lecturer at the Université Libre de Bruxelles and director of the REPI, the Recherche et Études en Politique Internationale. Finally, on the screens, you can see Ms. Dima Samaro in Skype connection from Tunis. She is a MENA policy associate at Access Now, where she works to promote human rights activism on the internet in the MENA region. So as you can see, we have several speakers tonight, so I would kindly ask to all of you not to talk more than 10 minutes. This way, everyone will have enough time to express their overview on today's subject, and also will give us time to have any question the audience might have. So I hope that at the end, there will be time for a constructive debate between the audience and the panelists here. And no more talkings from me. I will leave the floor to the panelists. I'm going to ask my colleague, Juliette, to start first. Then I invite Mr. Yusuf Al-Hori to proceed with his testimony. I would like to ask after him to Mr. Gianfranco Dell'Alba to tell us more about his NGO and the work that they are doing, and to Professor Christian Olsen to bring an academic view on this topic. And finally, to Dima Samaro to tell us more about activism on the internet. Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure for me to be today. Before I begin my speech, I would like to thank you, Mr. Tarabella, for hosting this event, and Mr. Giuseppe Meroni, who has been working with our office to pull this together. It's an honor for us having representatives from civil society organizations, Mr. Gianfranco Dell'Alba from No Peace Without Justice, and Ms. Dima Samaro from Access Now. I also wish to thank you, Professor Olson, for taking time off his busy agenda, and as well as Mr. Yusuf Al-Hori, a Bahraini activist now living in Berlin. My name is Juliette Akewa. I'm here on behalf of the European Center for Democracy and Human Rights, the European representation for a coalition of organizations striving to promote human rights and democracy in the Gulf region, with a particular focus on Bahrain. First of all, I would like to illustrate our work. Following that, I will introduce the general situation of human rights in Bahrain, bringing to your attention some particular cases. The European Center for Democracy and Human Rights engages with the European institutions, media, and relevant stakeholders in order to raise awareness and promote the protection of human rights in the Arabian Peninsula. We collaborate closely with international NGOs, NGO networks, in order to promote human rights and democracy in the region. According to the set of principles for the protection and promotion of human rights through action to combat impunity, impunity is the impossibility of bringing perpetrators into account, since they are not subject to any inquiry that might lead to their being accused, arrested, tried, and if found guilty, sentenced for appropriate penalties. In Bahrain, impunity has become systemic, as you may know, Every month, our office receives documentations regarding human rights abuses being committed by the Bahraini government against its citizens, violations that rarely become object of investigations by the by the Ombudsman, nor by any supervisory body. Those violations, even when denounced, are ignored by the judiciary system. And the culture of impunity in Bahrain denies justice to victims and allows human rights abusers to stay unpunished. Individuals are often targeted for crimes that amount not little more than exercising fundamental rights of freedom of expression, assembly, and association. And even in prison, retaliation exists. In fact, after being arrested, prisoners who should be under the protection of their own state are subjected to abuses and threats ranging from police brutality and torture to denial of medical care. The perpetrators of these crimes are almost never held accountable, and the impunity for even the worst offenders is widespread. There are also concerning reports, including from the United Nations Committee on Civil Rights and Political Rights, that government forces arbitrarily arrest human rights defenders as well as opposition activists, as well as bloggers and protesters. Members of the political opposition also are arbitrarily arrested, detained, imprisoned in a concerted campaign to eliminate the well-organized opposition. Among those are blogger, human rights defender Dr. Abdul Jalil Assingais, and the leader of the political opposition, Hassan Mushaima. They are both serving life term in prison because of their activism. Other notable cases are those of Nabil Rajab and Najib Fatil. Najib Fatil is a blogger and a human rights defender who was arrested without a warrant in 2013. Before tortured, before being sentenced to spurious charges to 25 years in prison. And Nabil Rajab, as you may know, is a prominent Bahraini activist who has been repeatedly arrested, convicted because of his activism. Nabil Rajab is currently serving 7 years in prison. He was sentenced in 2 cases for disseminating false rumors in times of war and for offending a foreign country regarding alleged torture in Jau prison and criticizing the killing of civilians in the Yemen war. However, Nabil Rajab and Najib Fatil are only 2 of 1,000 cases of activists who are convicted in Bahraini prisons. We also received credible and verifiable allegations of abuse against minors, as well as political prisoners, female political prisoners. In this regard, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has expressed its concern because security forces arrest and detain children and torture them and coerce them into confessing to bogus national security charges. Moreover, there have been also reports of women, several women, such as Medina Ali and Hajar Mansour, who are detained because of their peaceful activism and the activism of their relatives. For example, Hajar Mansour didn't commit a crime. She was arrested because of the activism of her son-in-law. So the widespread impunity and the government's failure to hold abusers accountable for torture and other violations led the country to the brink of a political crisis where the majority of the population has no adequate representation. However, the European Union has been receptive to these violations through urgent resolutions regarding Nabil Rajab and other death sentences. For example, the case of Mr. Mohammed Ramadan. In conclusion, Bahrain is a country whose culture of impunity is causing a human rights crisis. and human rights violations are unpunished, and abusers are not accountable for their actions. Bahrain should in our opinion, Bahrain should start a process to hold officers accountable, and this will imply a more independent and stronger ombudsman, Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, and judiciary system. And the independence of these bodies would ensure the right to fair trial and encourage a culture of accountability among the security forces. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everybody here, especially for Mr. Tarabella and Dibrella and Christian and our colleague also through Skype, Dima. And thanks you for also Julia for her speech. So, since 9 years ago, more than 400,000 people took to the street in Bahrain to protest due to lack of inequalities, corruption, oppression, and lack of government representation. Unfortunately, instead, the government response for the demand of the citizen, they use Saudi and Emirati forces to crush the citizen and the protest. Well, the result of human rights abuses in Bahrain, political leaders were arrested and tortured and had no fair trial, such as Abdul Wahab Hussein and Hassan Mushema and Sheikh Ali Salman. Political human rights leader or human rights defender were arrested and tortured without fair trial and without any access for their lawyers. Thousands of Shia citizens were fired from their job due to they are involved in peacefully protest. Revoked of citizenship for hundreds of Shia citizens. Among them was Sheikh Isa Qasim, which is the top of the hierarchy of Bahraini religious men. Suspension for Al Wafaq Society, the largest political party in Gulf, and they are also arrest the General Secretary Sheikh Ali Salman. Women and children also has been arrested, and as my colleague mentioned, Hajar Mansour and Zakiya al-Barburi. The only independent newspaper, Al-Wasat, was suspended of work and targeting their journalists. More than 40 mosques for Shia was dismantled and destroyed totally. Accordingly, I can say that the social contract between King of Bahrain and Bahraini citizen was no longer, because all of the human rights abuses, which is I said and which is my colleague also mentioned. Thank you.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for having invited us, and to Mark Tarabella for hosting this important event, and very well with a lot of public. No Peace Without Justice is actually active since more than 20 years. First of all, for the establishment of the international criminal justice. So we are in the point that the subject of this meeting is very appropriate, because our skill, the idea of having this, even this name, No Peace Without Justice, it was exactly for the purpose to establish a system to fight against impunity of perpetrator of the most heinous crime, and also of crimes against that goes also against citizens, against the people we are talking about. And that was our first important struggle, and at the end we contribute to the institution of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which is the place where some kind of crimes like those as been described could be addressed. But of course we know that the reality is much more complicated of that. That's why we are being interested in the Bahrain issue. And let me say something. At the beginning of the year 2000, so before 2011, we have even, let's say, have had a personal experience of cooperation with the Bahrain authority in trying to find a way and means to enhance democracy in their country. That was around 2004, 2005, 6, something like that. And of course, after 2011, situation is very clear. There is a fight between two big, let's say, taking a big spectrum, two big Muslim community in the Arab region, and especially in the Gulf region. And clearly what happened and what's going on is very damageable, and show clearly that those who support the King of Bahrain are certainly not friends of the other Muslim community living and being the majority of the country. We have followed it very carefully also the work of the Bassiouni Committee. That was, as you remember, the King, at that time, some pressure of the international community, the King of Bahrain announced the establishment of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry that was supposed to clear evidence and to fight responsible for the event that happened at that time. And that was chaired by a big friend of No Peace Without Justice, an Egyptian scholars, and called Sherry Bassiouni, that was one of the most eminent persons dealing with the international justice system, that was with us in the fight for the establishment of the International Criminal Court, and unfortunately he passed away a couple of years ago. And he tried to chair this committee, but of course nothing was happening. And so at the end, nobody has been not only nobody has been inquired, of course, but on the contrary, situation has been goes badly. And we managed to have many meetings in Bahrain before, but especially now in Europe. And I'm very happy to be here in the European Parliament, because we have brought years ago, only 3 or 4 years ago, we have brought opposition leader in the European Parliament in Italy to try to do let's say, do something similar to what we are doing today. And of course, I think that in this new phase of the European Union, the European Parliament, as you probably know, it is the most, let's say, if not powerful, at least influential EU institution in human rights and democracy promotion. And thanks to the presence of a very high qualified member of this parliament, I think that we need to push for another, of course, many others resolutions have been carried, but I'm sure that we have to keep the pressure for establishing a credible and impartial accountability mechanism to address not only in Bahrain, but also in other countries of the region, such a, let's say, international or if the country doesn't accept your inquiry, but we have other means to put pressure on government, and we have to stand firmly to do so, to try to push the authority of Bahrain and, of course, also the mother-in-law of this author, that means the Saudi and maybe probably the Emirati also, put pressure and put some bargain, some economic pressure too. As you know, all these countries are very well received in international fora. Saudi Arabia is the chair of the G20. Emirati will be host an important expo. I mean, all these things cannot go along with what happened in Bahrain. So this is my call to be here, not only to hear and not only, of course, to listen. Unfortunately, this testimony very qualified, but also to try to find how to act better and try to defend your right and defend the right of the Bahraini people, and especially for those who are in this moment in prison or for other reason indicted by the justice of their country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. Maybe I should start off by saying that I'm not a specialist of Bahrain in particular. I'm a political scientist with a long-standing interest in the Middle East. And as such, what I wanted to do is maybe try to shed light on the culture of impunity by placing the events in Bahrain since 2011 in the wider context of the Arab Springs, and hence insist on the specificities of Bahrain in this context. And maybe the first element that I would want to start with is that to a great extent, it's really a missed opportunity of democratic transition, the case of Bahrain, for the simple reason that the stage was set for a successful democratic transition, in the sense that Bahrain is a country that has had an early economic development compared to the other Gulf democracies, starting in the 19th century, much thanks to the pearl industry, also to the fact that it's a commercial hub, the fact that the British fleet was present, which has had as a consequence that it has been a country, and still is, that is highly economically developed and diversified, especially compared to other Gulf monarchies that are very much focused, as you know, on the oil economy. One of the consequences of this economic development is that a significant part of the Bahraini population, around 50%, are, let's say, of Bahraini origins and hence are not expatriates, which is very different from, let's say, the Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, or the other Gulf countries. And of course, from a political point of view, this implies that, from the second half of the 20th century, there's been a burgeoning civil society movement in Bahrain, and also a democratic opposition that has put pressure on the monarchy. In spite of that, as we all know, the Arab Spring in Bahrain has rather been a winter quite rapidly, with large-scale repression, including use of helicopters and tanks against civilian demonstrators, the use of torture, and all of this without significant, let's say, backlash effect, be it internally or internationally, at least if we compare to other countries of the Arab Spring. So the question maybe that I wanted to focus on is why did the mass repression sadly succeed without causing a split in the armed forces like happened in Syria, Yemen, or Libya, without leading the military to change the leadership themselves like happened in Egypt, and without the military siding with the demonstrators like happened in Tunisia. So why did these three possible events that happened in other countries not happen in Bahrain? In terms of political science, that's the question of what is often called the dictator's dilemma, which is the idea that all dictators have a propensity to want to use their armed forces against domestic opposition, especially when they call for more democracy. This is all the more the case in Bahrain, as the armed forces of Bahrain, although symbolically they are supposed to be able to fight against external aggression, in reality it's a counterinsurgent force that is nearly 100% focusing on domestic opposition rather than on threats coming from outside. And the dictator's dilemma is the idea that if you use the military against civilian demonstrators, there's always a risk that the military uses this opportunity to intervene in domestic politics and take power. Usually states, dictatorial regimes use diverse techniques to try to avert, to try to deal with this dictator's dilemma, which is called coup-proofing. Coup-proofing is the way in which a dictatorial regime tries to prevent coups from arriving from the military. In the case of countries like Syria, Yemen, and Libya, one technique of coup-proofing has been tribal, ethnic, or confessional factionalism or favoritism, as you probably all know, which has had as a consequence that when the Arab Spring started in these countries, the armed forces basically split in two halves, one side siding with the demonstrators and the other with the regime. In the case of Tunisia, one technique of coup-proofing that has been used has been the marginalization of the military in the favor of the police forces, but with the paradoxical effect that the military actually sided because of this marginalization with the demonstrators, luckily, when the Arab Spring started, and hence this successful Arab Spring in Tunisia. There are other techniques of coup-proofing. In Egypt, for example, Mubarak gave significant economic leverage to the armed forces. So the armed forces were in charge of a big part of the Egyptian economy, which is also a way of making sure that the armed forces have no interest in toppling a dictator that gives economic advantages. So the question is, how has Bahrain succeeded in a certain way in avoiding the dictator's dilemma? And what are the coup-proofing techniques that the country has used? Maybe the first point to highlight in this regard is the fact that Bahrain is a so-called dynastic monarchy, which is different from, let's say, traditional monarchies that are personalist, in the sense that a dynastic monarchy is a monarchy in which a whole dynasty and hence a whole clan is in control of the state, and in particular, in the case of Bahrain, of the oil economy, meaning that it's not only one person that is in charge of the economy, but actually a whole clan, which makes dynastic monarchies actually quite resilient in the face of democratic uprisings. And this has been the case in all of the Arab monarchies during the Arab Spring. And from that point of view, Bahrain is not an exception. But of course, this has meant that all of the branches of the armed forces of Bahrain are headed by family members of the Al Khalifa royalty. The armed forces are largely staffed by people from Sunni tribes, mostly not coming from cities, but actually from countryside. So they are tribalized and feel a strong solidarity with the regime against the majority population. So that's, let's say, the component of ethnic and confessional favoritism or factionalism that other regimes have used as well. And the third element, maybe that singularizes Bahrain compared to other regimes that have been exposed to the Arab Spring, is the fact that Bahrain has massively resorted to mercenaries. In other words, to well, the fact that the rank and file combatants of the Bahraini defense forces are actually people from Pakistan, Jordan, and other countries, Yemen, amongst others. who have been granted economic advantages, who have been granted Bahraini citizenship, and who obviously have a strong solidarity with the Bahraini regime for the simple reason that should that regime be ousted, they would probably lose the economic and political advantages that they have been granted. So yes, so it implies that when the uprising started in Bahrain, there has been a very strong solidarity between people of the security apparatus, both for family reason and the fact that the Al Khalifa family is strongly in control of all the branches of the armed forces, which is, as I already said, a counterinsurgent force rather than a defense force as we usually understand it. But secondly, because a lot of them are actually people who have been granted citizenship in exchange for them actually participating in the counterinsurgency against the Bahraini population, which to a great extent explains why the dictator's dilemma has not had the same dramatic effect in Bahrain as it has had in countries in which the Arab Spring have been more successful. So maybe just to conclude, maybe just say that although people often focus on the fact that the Gulf Cooperation Council countries have sent troops to Bahrain, I would say that this, and I think most political scientists agree with the fact that it's not as much this factor that actually has led to this mass repression of the movement, since it's actually the Bahraini Defense Forces themselves that have engaged in this mass repression. But the GCC has played a role in actually freeing up the Bahraini Defense Forces for, let's say, more traditional security missions in order to specialize solely in repression, in using tanks and helicopters against civilian demonstrators and using widespread torture against the population, hence the tragic events in the case of Bahrain. And I'll finish there.
So now I will leave the floor to Dima Samaro. Thank you for joining us on Skype. And please tell us more about what you do in your job. Thank you.
Oh God, no. Oh. Try? No. It worked. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, even though I didn't get the chance to be there in person, but I'm really pleased that I get this opportunity. And I'm really happy about the insights and the points of views that I have heard so far. And it's really important to host such a session about the status of Bahrain, and especially when it comes to human rights violations. So I just would like to start by saying that the current trend of using new technologies, including various social networking platforms, has played a critical role in affecting regional politics and the flow of information and how it's controlled. Instead of working to limit the negative ways the internet and other technologies can be used, for instance, when it comes to disinformation, however, the government of Bahrain has taken to closing the online space by implementing harsh and oppressive cybercrime law that do little other than robbing internet users of their basic human rights. The Bahraini cybercrime law, passed in 2014, gives various government organizations, including the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Public Information, the capacity to block and censor a wide range of websites. No court order is needed to censor websites that host content deemed a challenge to the government, such as any published content that is critical of the Bahraini government, the royal family, or the status quo. And this actually was the case of Al-Wasati newspaper that was mentioned in the opening of this session. And to follow more on the repression online, in May 2019, Bahrain has threatened to take legal action against people who follow Twitter accounts which criticize the country's government. It was part of a drastic new crackdown on political dissent. Bahrain's Ministry of Interior announced, and I quote, Those who follow inciting accounts that promote sedition and circulate their posts will be held legally accountable. And Bahrain has intensified its campaign against dissents and activists in recent months and made explicit that it would punish online dissent with jail time and large fines. The punishment for encouraging sedition, calling for the overthrow of the regime, actually was up to 5 years. And besides that, also the counter-terrorism law may also be used to charge and detain activists and human rights defenders. On May 23, 2019, the King of Bahrain approved the amendment of Law Number 58 of 2006 regarding the protection of society from terrorist acts. Under this amendment, and especially Article 11 of the law, it has been replaced to become a prison sentence of no more than 5 years and a fine of no less than 2,000 Bahraini dinars and no more than 5,000 dinars. It's around 13K US dollars, shall be imposed on anyone who by any means promotes means of terrorism. So it's obviously under this text, there is no clear definition of what is incitement or like what are the means of terrorism the law really want to explain. So due to the vagueness of the text, of course, human rights activists and internet users can be targeted and they can silence them and prosecute them as a result. Bahrain also tends to charge human rights defenders under the pretext of harming civil peace and social fabric. And it also was the case of Nabil Rajab that was mentioned. As the Internet Freedom Index in Bahrain may decline as a result of taking these arbitrary measures against internet users, where Bahrain is a country that is not free on the internet according to the Freedom on the Internet Index that was published last year. As a result, this would negatively affect freedom of expression, creativity, and creation of a democratic society on the internet and beyond. We actually have within Access Now a helpline and digital security team that provides kind of legal aid and support to people who are at risk. So for instance, if someone, we received, for instance, last year, 5 cases from activists where they published a content that have been taken down. And bear in mind that in the one case, it might include many cases, but like number of cases, it's not only one case. So we received many cases, and we provide tools of protection for these activists and the responses to how they can better protect themselves online. By the end of this, we called the Bahraini government to re-review the strategy of cybersecurity and especially the cybercrime law, and as it has an adverse impact not only on journalists but also on all of the internet users and activists in Bahrain. Bahrain also must reconsider setting clear standards and concepts free from ambiguity rather than suppressing rights and freedom that leads to arbitrary arrest of activists and social media pioneers. The ongoing and non-stop violations to the right of freedom of expression and the misuse of the judicial system to criminalize online expression, silence human rights activists, and muzzle government critics should put to an end to better advance the status of rights and freedom in the country. And this is what we really hope to achieve in Bahrain. And so it's important to document these cases and to take it to the next level. And I really appreciate EU's efforts in passing all of these resolutions and working to promote like a democratic societies in the region. And just to add one more note, it's the issue is not only in Bahrain. It starts with one country. For instance, if you have social media regulation, which is coming to our region, but so far, for instance, in Qatar, they have approved the fake news law. So it means that this law might be coming to other countries in the region, and this is what makes us, scared about what's coming next and how social media platforms and more activists and more journalists could be detained due to this repression on human rights. I think that's it for my end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your intervention. So you have heard different point of views. You have heard an MEP talking. You have heard the point of views of two different NGOs. You've heard the direct testimony of Yusuf, which is a Bahraini activist. You've heard an academic point of view, and you've also heard more about the repression that happens also on the internet. So now I would like to know if you have any question to any of the speakers here in particular. So I will leave the floor to the audience. Please. Yeah, I think you just have...
Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation, for the organization of the event, and also for the speakers. And I think that we didn't talk about education and the people of Bahrain. And Professor also talked about how a clan, a dynasty, kind of take the state in hostage. And my question is more about the change of generation and how can we avoid that system to reproduce itself, and how the youth in Bahrain can be, how can we act on the youth of Bahrain to avoid the youth to reproduce what has been doing by the region. How can the NGOs or even official institution can act on that and maybe try through education or maybe online campaign to influence the youth to not reproduce the system. Thank you.
Sure, the education, one of the issue, which is more useful to approach to this point, and capturing people and also combining with this issue, it will be more useful for Bahrain youth. We have more than 3,000 youth in the prison now because they are involving in political and protest or peacefully protest in the street only because they are using their right. So also our colleague Christian, he can also, as he's academic, he can add more in this issue.
Thank you. Well, I think there are two problems. One is obviously the one that the situation, the current situation has led indeed to a lot of youths being in prison and not going to school, and hence in terms of educational level, obviously the current events can only have a negative effect. But I think another aspect that maybe also should be focused upon is that a lot of the people in Bahrain who have a higher education are, however, often unemployed for the simple reason that they're not of the right community and that they don't manage to find work. So there also is a, let's say, more structural problem, which is that, yeah, the 70% of the population, although they have higher education and have a high level, high-level diplomas, are excluded both from public life but also from the private sector, which, of course, is not a good incentive to push people to get an education. And the third problem, obviously, is how do you favor an independent educational system in a regime such as the Bahraini one? And well, that's a difficulty that I will not be able to address.
Thank you for your question.
I don't know if it's working. Yeah, okay. So yeah, hello everyone, and thank you again for your interventions. My question is about the religious point of view in Bahrain, and I wanted to know if, for example, NGOs are collaborating with religious leaders from there, and if actually they try to find solutions together to what's happening and to the violations of the numerous human rights. And yeah, so I wanted to know if religious leaders are doing something and if you are collaborating with them in order to find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Just I want to interrupt for this. Well, what I've seen since 9 years, because not I am Bahraini, I want to say that. No, because what the international also say, what the NGOs, independent NGOs also said, we don't see any violation from the protest from Bahrainis during 9 years now. So, and the another side also, the religious leaders also, the political leaders, the human rights defender also, they are always advising people to not approach to this area, violence area. So since 9 years, the violence coming from the regime, not from the protest. Actually.
I see someone else over there that raised the hand. Yep.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It's more of a question to Mr. Del Alba. You talked about the economic sanctions that could be put on Bahrain, but as I understand, they are kind of supported by the Saudi government, which would probably then help them out. This is my point of view. Is there any way that they could also be how do I put this into words? To help them see that they should do better with the Bahrain case? Thank you.
I speak in general on the fact that we must do something, and of course, the spectrum of the sanction for a healthy country, and especially considering the relationship that we have with with the Arab world and with certain countries in particular, on the Gulf in particular, is very difficult to apply concretely, especially for the link existing and the fact that next week, if not this week, at least the finance minister of the G20 country will be there, will be in Riyadh for attending an important meeting on the G20. So situation is complex. It's not like, let's say, Afghanistan or North Korea. But I wanted to say that I think that for such kind of case, we need to explore any possible means of putting pressure on this country. Of course, the United Nations system or the European system, and in particular the European Parliament, are, let's say, well placed at least to speak about this issue, even if we know, of course, we are all aware that we face a difficult situation in pushing when economic interests are so important and for both parties. But clearly, we have to find a way to stress the importance of the lack of impunity, that this impunity affect and undermine must undermine the relationship with the country and all the country involved in.
Thank you for the question, and to Mr. Del Alba for the great answer. Yeah, please.
So thank you all for your testimonies. I would just like to rebound on what has just been said on the economic pressures that can be put on on the country to suppress these violations. At what point do you think that these can have negative impacts and actually bring more conflict between collaborations with this country? And another point that I would like to stress from what Mr. Olson has said about the conflicts between the two Muslim communities, do you think that it's important to intervene in those conflicts to then establish a more prosper democracy, or is it of any means important to have an impact in that area, or is it not relevant? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question.
Maybe I'll just say that. Yeah, maybe I would just guard against presenting it solely as, let's say, a opposition between religious communities, for the simple reason that it has been an ongoing confrontation, let's say, between the regime and diverse forms of opposition. And historically, it was more like left-wing opposition to the monarchy that progressively has become more and more religious in the 90s. And I wouldn't say that today it's necessarily more religious than it was in the 90s. So I think still today it's more complex than simply Sunni and Shia, although statistically that still remains the, let's say, the main fault line. But it's not only an economic fault, religious fault line, it's also an economic one, political one. So yeah, I think it's more complicated than simply religion, although of course that is quite maybe banal to say that. But maybe in terms of, yeah, in terms of what could be done, I think that definitely there would be something to be done at the, let's say, at the level of media, because, for example, we hear today a lot about the Iraq, so the movements in Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, but we hear actually very little about what is going on in Bahrain, and that's quite disturbing that it's actually so absent from media coverage. And although, of course, media cannot do anything, let's say, directly, I mean, indirectly, the fact that people are not very conscious of what's going on in Bahrain still, I think, is well, can only have a negative impact on international pressure.
Yeah. May I add? Yes. No, I want just to add that speaking about economic sanction can be said also at large. For instance, Joseph Borrell, the new High Representative for Foreign Policy, has set up a group to study a sort of, I'm sure I'm wrong and the name is wrong, Matzensky proceeding, something like that, that exists. It implies a sort of list of people that a country can sanction, for instance, not giving them the passport or the authorization to come in Europe or something like that. I mean, there is formula that tackle a specific individual, then we consider not properly act in terms of respect of human rights, etc., etc. And so that could be a formula. This idea is running in the external services, and in principle, during the first half of the year, in principle, it must be adopted by the European institution, and the case of Bahrain and the people leading the country could be raised on this occasion, for instance. It's a soft sanction, but it's something that could exist and could be applied, for instance, studying the case and finding, let's say, evidence, etc. Thank you.
I think that so kind of sanctions are not so symbolic, because they are very impacted and affected. If you impeach people responsible of the power to circulate freely, to go to London, to go to outside of the country, their children studying outside. It's a real sanction. And I think that's for other country. I remember in my former term, I was involved in the delegation with Southeast Asia. We spoke about that, about the country. They were sensitive. And the answer of the High Representative, oh, if you do that, there are more sanctions than it appears, I think.
Thank you very much to everyone. Please.
I have a question on regarding the sanctions again. Right now, there's a lot of emerging powers, like for example, China. How do you think that, like right now, those country in question doesn't have more choice of countries to cooperate with? For example, with China, there's a lot more or less conditions to comply. How EU could address that issue? That's my question.
You know, Europe has taken, there is one big case dealing with sanction, and it concerns Russia. After the invasion, let's say invasion of Crimea by the Russian, Europe decided to set up sanctions against Russia. And at the end, since 4 years, it's always a problem, this issue, because even if the sanction doesn't affect completely all the sectors, etc., they are certainly contributed to a climate which is relatively tense between Europe and Russia, exactly because the existence of sanctions of such a kind. Of course, that was a military intervention that was not accepted by the international community, so that was a clear case in which let's say it's easy to say, well, you have invaded another country, that is not acceptable. Moreover, this country was in discussion with the European Union for an agreement, so that was a very tough issue. And of course, China or other countries has mentioned it from time to time, but of course, sanctioning China is difficult for other reasons. So I think the word sanction means a reaction on other way that simply said you have not to put in jail these people, you are not to kill these, because Europe needs some way of let's say, to exert a power, at least in terms of influence. Of course, the world actually is not exactly in the mood of was, let's say, 20 years ago, when I say all the time that today it will be impossible to establish an international criminal court. That was possible 20 years ago. Today, if you see the picture of the leader of the world, I think it will be much more difficult, even impossible. So we have to consider all these elements. But clearly, in this particular case, I think that there is room at least to see what can be done to sensitize, and of course the media as crucial, to sensitize the public opinion and the political leader to do something on this situation that it really is really serious.
Maybe just one point. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that if sanctions are going to be efficient in the case of Bahrain, it will be mainly for, let's say, political reasons. And as we mentioned previously, for example, by limiting the freedom of movement on the part of the political elite, or also because they have symbolic importance. I mean, they show that the international community disapproves of what is going on. Yeah. But I don't think that anybody really believes that they're going to be economically efficient in the sense of putting economic pressure on Bahrain, for the simple reason that the main supporter of Bahrain remains Saudi Arabia. And I mean, what Saudi Arabia represents in terms of wealth and political support will probably count much more than actually the few economic effects that economic sanctions can have.
So, hello. Thank you very much for your presentations and answers to our questions. My question concerns the Mr. Alori talked about people with their nationality being revoked, and I was wondering what the European Union policy is regarding those people, how the situation could be improved, and yeah, what are the challenges that this situation is causing? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. By the way, I am one of the also revoked citizenship. Unfortunately, I didn't see any action, strong action or strong language from United Europe or from international community regarding these abuses of human rights, which is, I think, only Bahrain, the one country in the world using this punishment against the political and human rights activities. I am here for this, one of this issue I have to highlight about it. I want to hear also from the panelists also what they can do for this issue, because, you know, imagine I'm here in Europe, so at least I have travel document. But we have some families also in Arab countries, they don't have anything, or those in some countries, they don't have any rights, especially for medical access or education, or for they have the new children which is born in exile out of Bahrain now. So it is a difficult situation I face, and really it's a challenge for me. I don't know, with a few years now, my children, what they are nationality. They are not German, not Bahraini. It's a difficult situation.
Yes.
Firstly, thank you for organizing this very interesting event. My question is about the Saudi military supports for Bahrain, which became very evident, for example, during the Arab Spring, and about the fact that although the EU has a very strong human rights agenda, Saudi Arabia buys a considerable amount of arms from EU member states, even Belgium and Germany. And I was wondering how the EU tries to deal with this constellation, with this seeming difficult situation, and how, for example, the S&D group tries to work around this issue.
Of course, what you mentioned is a real issue that we discuss about also in Belgium, because you know that weapons are fabricated in the region of Liège, my region, and it's a debate also, and the position. I think that it's right to say the solution has to come from Europe, because as you know, it's very sensitive, also in Belgium, but also at the European level, because if the decision to take, and it's I think that our former Prime Minister Charles Michel told that also in the Walloon region, Mr. Boursu, former Minister President of the Walloon region, said, if we have to take a decision, it's at the European level. Why? Because if Belgium doesn't export any more weapons to Saudi Arabia, probably English, French, or German are very pleased to substitute the Belgian, and we lose employee in some factory for arms in Belgium, but and again in France, UK, they are not anymore member of the European Union, but we have to decide at the European level. But it's, frankly, first of all, between brackets, but it's not sincerely, I'm not member of the committee which is involved in those matters, is clearly the Foreign Affairs Committee, AFET. I'm member of the DEVE. Also, I'm involved in human rights because DEVE developments clear policy on that. And I don't know the discussion that they have in the committee. And in plenary, it's difficult to have a common opinion on that because you have several interests from several countries, or it's cross-party, this issue. And, but I share with you, if we decide to avoid, to export weapons to Saudi Arabia, for example, it's at the European level that we have to decide. But I think it's not tomorrow that we decide that, frankly, because it's also sensitive, economic interest, and of course it's difficult and to decide on that. But it would be a sanction, a kind of sanction, of course.
I just want to ask to the speakers here if they have any recommendation for the future, any idea if, for example, the EU has to do something different, change strategy to address these kind of issues, especially the culture of impunity, because we have been talking about that all day.
Well, we hope that the European Union, the European Parliament will keep working on the promotion and protection of human rights in Bahrain, as it is done in the past, with urgent resolutions of Nabil Rajab, and MEPs also will give Bahrain attention in their parliamentary work.
Any other recommendation would you suggest?
Maybe a precision. As I mentioned in my speech, Bahrain is probably the country that that received the most important number of resolutions since 2011, 8. Of course, it's symbolic, as you mentioned, but I think that the country are sensitive. You know, I remember about Cambodia. I remember I contribute to mention the name of one guy, opponent to the regime, in a resolution that I negotiated the name of my group. You know, as MEP, you have several moments, a little bit magic in your life, and 6 months after, a rendezvous with a Cambodian woman, and she came in my office because in my life, political life, I have a principle: is to receive all people who want to meet me, students for end of study work, for example, but also all stakeholders, opponents. I receive all. Half an hour, fixed appointment, arrive on time, please, because I respect the time. And I remember 6 months after, I received this woman accompanied by the guy, but I didn't know that before, the guy that I mentioned the name in the resolution. And he told me, he was free, but he told me, the day when you vote, because I knew after that you vote on this moment, the resolution, the European Parliament, the Thursday in Strasbourg in plenary, my condition of detention were changed. He moved to another part of the prison. He ate 3 times per day, and they were very careful. And 3 months after, he was free. I know it's a moment you say, you put the name, maybe it's not useful. Yes, it's useful. Sometimes it's changed a life. We are a kind of public Amnesty International lobbyist. And I think that's when a country is mentioned in a resolution, you have the ambassador to come in the parliament and to try to meet all political groups, and to try to influence the term of the resolution. And I think it's useful. And if we be careful, be sure that in the future, when you mention some abuse in Bahrain and in other countries, because unfortunately Bahrain is not the only country in the world where, you know, we have 3 emergencies per month in the plenary in Strasbourg, and we have to choose 3. Is the rule. Otherwise, 30 at least, 50 merit to be mentioned each month. And I think that we continue. And as new member of the DARP delegation, of course, it's my role. I receive more NGOs, but also opponents or people suffering from the regime. And be sure that they are not only to, you have a special committee on human rights, is the subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee involved in those matters. And I think that we continue in the future to be careful with what happens in Bahrain and in particular in Bahrain. As I mentioned, you know, I have to leave because at 7 o'clock I have another meeting outside of the Parliament, and my principle is to arrive on time everywhere for respect for people joining this meeting. And so for that I have to leave in a few minutes. But frankly, don't hesitate when you have the wish to invite. And it's interesting because we have many students here and from outside. It's very interesting. Because sometimes we organize a meeting and there are 5 delivered to speech and 2 people coming. 2 people and 3 camera. And by today it's positive and at your disposal. Not every week, it's impossible, but when you want, at your disposal.
Thank you very much for your intervention here, all the questions that you answered. So if you have any further question for Tarabella MEP, this is the moment to ask, because as he said, he has to leave. So. Thank you very much for being here and for hosting us. It was really interesting. Thank you. So I think that if there are no more questions, we can bring this. Oh, sorry.
Is it working? I think the possible solutions, the radical solutions, can only be found in the region. So I was actually wondering the main reason, because when we were talking about this issue, we say 9 years. So 9 years looks like accumulated anger. So I actually want to learn the reason that actually people somehow support what is happened, because if the violation is not stopped in 9 years, there might be the supporters and they have the perception that they still somehow lean on and that they want to they want this to be going. So from your perspective, I want to understand what they think and why, what is the triggering thing for them to make this long for 9 years.
I can promise on behalf Bahrain citizens, Bahrain people, the peaceful protest and the peaceful demand and the peaceful way it will continue until end. We will not use violence in Bahrain because we see the result in other country when those involving in the violence. So our choice and our tools to reach to our demand peacefully and delegate only. And then in the end, we will get the result. We see the history. Those they are involving with the violence, what is the result? And we don't want to also go through this way also. Thank you.
As you can see also, Dima Samaro had to leave us, but if there are no more questions, we can close. Sorry, go please.
So we've heard a lot of ideas on sanctions or European interventions or whatever, but we've heard them from people outside of Bahrain. So my question now is to Mr. Al-Houri. What do Bahraini citizens expect from the EU and from outside organizations?
Thank you for your question. Well, sure, the Bahraini citizens, they are expecting more efforts from European people and NGOs through their advocacy in here in this Europe Parliament or in Geneva Human Rights Council or from the media also. And especially, I know you are academic also, it can get more highlight in your university or in your social media or as solidarity with my people in Bahrain.
So thank you for the questions. Thanks all of you for being here today. We've heard so many different point of view, so different perspective from Yusuf, from Gianfranco Dell'Alba, from Professor Olson, Tarabella, and as well from Juliet. All their speech have demonstrated that in Bahrain there is an ongoing lack of accountability, and that not only harms the rule of law, but only human rights and international standards. Many concerns have been raised also about human rights activists. We mentioned the cases of Nabil Rajab, Abdul Hadi Al-Kawaja, we mentioned Hajar Mansour, but we also heard story of normal citizens. For example, Yusuf was mentioning his family. So there are many troubles that are still going on, and Bahraini citizens are still victims of culture of impunity, and they are not able to enforce their rights. So in this situation, international institutions and also European communities can be decisive stakeholders in monitoring Bahrain commitments to any international standard, and as well in promoting human rights and raising awareness of any breaches or violation of human rights. During today, this lecture went straight to the point, as it represented an opportunity to gather activists, but also NGOs, academics, and members of these parliaments, which brought their expertise from different perspectives. Also, like we were talking with Dima before about new technologies, so also it's new challenges today's world. So we have tried to highlight which kind of influence the EU can have on this kind of situation, and especially on Bahrain obligations on human rights, especially through, as mentioned before, Tarabella MEP, resolutions, which are very effective. They can actually bring something to the table and help going towards a solution for the problem. And because of this conference could be part of a widespread and fruitful European institution to safeguard human rights, I would like to thank you one more time for being here. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you also to the speakers present here. Again, Mr. Yusuf Al-Houri, Mr. Gianfranco Dell'Alba, Professor Olson, Mark Arabella, that is not here anymore, and Juliet Akewa. Of course, the Masamara as well. Now, I would please ask you to not to leave the room, because we will leave it all together as an entire group. And Mr. Meroni, just follow him towards the exit. So thank you very much and have a good night.
Alla faccia del destra.